Hey, this video contains spoilers for the following pieces of media. You've been warned.
Be it reality or fiction, immortality and eternal youth are both highly coveted by the many, as it opens up a seemingly infinite number of doors ripe with opportunity. Those blessed enough to be granted eternal life don't need to choose what they want and don't want to do with their limited time, but rather they are spoiled with the ability to do and see it all. Given eternal life, you can master all the arts, learn every language, and travel to every corner of the world, all with plenty of time to spare. Unfortunately, immortality and all its benefits aren't readily available to us real beings of Earth, unless you happen to be a jellyfish or Keanu Reeves. Though, I suppose only time will tell if our very own YouTube sensation and resident techno-lich Brian Johnson is onto something or not with his longevity project. And if he is, then rejoice, because immortality will be available to us all for the low prize of $2 million per year. At least if you're able to secure a lifetime deal for that prize, then you should be able to live long enough for inflation to whittle those millions down into the value of pennies, but I digress. Anyhow, in the realm of fiction, some fantastical peoples and creatures just happen to be immortal from the get-go, with elves being the poster children for this category of awfully long-lived folks. As for the people fortunate enough to exist within the realm of fiction, but unfortunate enough to be born mortal, it's not necessarily impossible for them to live forever. However, immortality rarely comes cheaply to these people, though the price is typically not one of money. Instead of going gentle into that good night, they may rage against the dying of the light and seize immortality for themselves. It might cost them their soul in a Faustian trade, or if they're willing to go all in the villain stocks, it might cost them the souls of millions of innocents instead. If you think the latter sounds like something you'd be willing to do, then you should probably consider applying for an apprenticeship under a local lich of your choice, and if you can't find one, then maybe becoming a CEO is the second best thing for you. Now, the idea of someone immortal dying seems like a bit of an oxymoron, doesn't it? After all, how can eternal life have an end? Eternity should last forever, shouldn't it? This assumption will become relevant later on, but for now it's worth mentioning that not all immortality comes with invulnerability, which means that life more or less continues to be as fragile as it is for us mortals. I mean, elf and human alike can both be wiped out in a single moment when God's drunkest driver comes swerving down the lane in a Ford F-450 and 6 shots of tequila coursing through their system. Just because the lack of a biological expiration date means you can live forever doesn't mean that you will. But then, even invulnerability can sometimes have its weaknesses. These kinds of weaknesses that can put an end to an otherwise unkillable being are quite literally Achilles' heels, a term which is obviously derived from the fact that the heel of the Greek hero Achilles was the only part of his body that wasn't impervious to damage. To use another example, a vampire is typically going to live forever unless you lure them into the sun, drag them across running water, or force feed them with garlic bread. Now that I think of it, I'm coming to realize that this also sounds like the best way to kill a Reddit mod. You make them touch grass in the sunlight, take a shower, and eat something other than dino nuggies. If they somehow survive the trauma of not living a terminally online life for a day, then they probably aren't going to go back to their old ways afterward, so in either outcome you've purged the world of a Reddit moderator. But if we return to the topic at hand, all this begs the question, what happens when immortality doesn't last forever? When the infinite becomes finite and eternity ends? How does the loss of such a permanent fixture of the world affect that which is left behind? And what impact does it have on the reader or viewer of the story? Well, this is precisely what I'd like to examine here today. So hi, I'm Perseus Grimm, and prepare yourself as we take a closer look at what happens when immortals die. Oh, and if you'd like to help me live forever inside your phone or computer, all you need to do is subscribe to the channel, like or dislike the video, and maybe write detailed instructions for your preferred rite of ascension to immortality in the comments. Okay, thanks. I suppose it would make the most sense for me to start with the more tangible side of things. So an immortal is dead, and now the world is left to deal with the consequences of it. It should come as no surprise that someone or something that has lived for as long as only an immortal could will likely end up becoming something highly significant to the world around it. Sometimes beings blessed with eternal life might leverage their boon to hone their skills and grow their power to become rulers, archmages, or simply paragons of knowledge. Other times, the entities in question are immortal as a result of being something inherently important, such as gods or other divinely powerful entities like celestial beings, fey creatures, and fiends. And then there are cases like the 2011 movie ironically titled Immortals, where the very opening scene features an unsanctimonious slaughter of the supposedly immortal Greek gods, with even big shots like Athena being reduced to little more than an NPC to be used and discarded like a condom. In either case, the death of such an immortal is certain to leave a void behind. For better or worse, immortal Immortals of this kind are a sort of constant force promising stability to their surroundings. They are linchpins, which in time become the pillars carrying the weight of the world as it's known on their shoulders, like Atlas. And so, on the rare occasion when these pillars are suddenly knocked out, the world quakes and gets plummeted into a time of great change and tumult. Arcane Studios' aptly titled game Dishonored: Death of the Outsider features an example of precisely what I'm talking about. By the way, should I even bother with a spoiler alert here? I mean, the Outsider's death is literally mentioned in the title of the game. I have no idea how you'd even end up in a position where you're playing the game without having read the title, and forget it, I'll just move on. For the uninitiated, the eponymous character of the game is a rather tricky figure whose morals are entirely ambiguous. He is neither good nor evil, and he grants his mark of power to anyone who finds themselves in a unique position to change the world, regardless if that change is beneficial or detrimental to everyone else. He is not an arbiter of ethics, but a simple observer and subsequent enabler of the events that would likely find a way of happening anyway. While he may enable great evil by gifting the wrong people with immense powers, he likewise enables great good to be done, as is evident if you don't play the games like an absolute murder hobo. As you reach the end of Death of the Outsider, you find yourself faced with a choice to kill or spare the Outsider himself. You can strike him down with a twin-bladed knife or release him from the curse that binds him to the void. But there's an additional layer to this onion of black magic, because regardless whether the man is spared or slain, the mythological figure that is the Outsider still dies. If you spare him, the game's protagonist Billy very much confirms this, stating that the Outsider is no more, and with that, the world will change in ways none of us can know. It's not so different to what Billy's mentor Dowd remarks if you do kill him, saying that you've cut away the knot at the center, the rest will fall to pieces, the world will finally change. In the end, the single most important constant is that both scenarios emphasize the fact that the Outsider's end will cause great changes to the world. And change it does. Whether the Outsider's existence was a net positive, negative, or neutral, it is clear that his presence was holding a lot of things in place. In terms of society, he's not only an idol of worship for the occasional cultist, but also the Luciferian figure to the Abbey of the Evermen, which serves as the dominant religion across the Empire of the Isles. If you read the Dishonored novels, you'll learn that the Outsider's death eventually leads to the dissolution of the Abbey itself, and you can only imagine what would happen if one of the major world religions in our real world ceased to be one day, suddenly leaving millions or even billions of believers completely without a faith. It would be a calamity, and somehow it's not even the greatest disaster that his absence creates. With the Outsider gone, the void itself grows unstable, hungry perhaps. You can only dread what awful future trails behind the rising sun of the next dawn. But dread it or not, the sun rises at the dawn of every new day again and again and again, until maybe it doesn't anymore. Or more specifically, maybe one day every sunrise will be one and the same, heralding yesterday to be repeated time and time again. The game Deathloop features a 1960s-esque world filled with a mixture of sci-fi tech and fantasy magic that might not seem related to the world of Dishonored at first, but as the puzzle pieces fall into place, we learn that the two franchises actually do share a world, separated only by little over a century on the timeline. While Deathloop itself is centered around a type of pseudo-immortality caused by a time loop that we will touch more on later, what's interesting for now is one of the game's endings, namely the one where you break the loop you're stuck in. Oxymoronic as it may sound, as a new day comes for the first time in what might be thousands or millions of days on Black Reef, it's immediately evident that something isn't quite right about the world beyond the isolated island. Now, while we might attribute the desolation beyond the loop to the world having ended in a nuclear apocalypse or having been destroyed by climate change while our protagonist was still stuck in time, taking a closer look at the nebulous-looking sky should tell you that there's something more to it than that. I don't know about you, but to me it doesn't really look like something a few tsar bombas or global warming due to burning too much whale oil could cause even on the worst day. Even if that could vaporize an ocean, I don't think it could paint the sky like that. My personal belief is that the Golden Loop ending shows us the inevitable end result of the change brought about by the events in Death of the Outsider. It's the void run amok, possibly having swallowed the entire world as we knew it from the Dishonored games. In a more metaphorical way, the Outsider's death eventually killed the very celestial titan that is the planet of both game franchises. I suspect it may have even caused the death of the Dishonored series altogether, not because the game was so bad that it killed all excitement around it, because it was a good game, but rather because it's hard to imagine a Dishonored game without that black-eyed man speaking to you from the void. At this point, we need to address the softer and more emotional effects of a dead immortal, especially in regards to how it affects the audience. After all, such a weighty event is practically guaranteed to not only change the fictional world, but also evoke some feeling or another in the audience. I'd like to use an example from Brandon Sanderson's books set in the Cosmere. In Mistborn, you have the shape-shifting Khandra, the creepy and powerful Steel Inquisitors, and the mighty tyrant known as the Lord Ruler. In Warbreaker, you have the Returned, and in Elantris, you have the appropriately named Elantrins, both of which are essentially demigods. And speaking of divinity, there are of course also the so-called Shards of Adenalsium, who make up what could be considered the pantheon of the Cosmere at large, all of which ironically enough derive their power from the splinters of a dead god even more powerful than them. Throughout Sanderson's many books, there are certainly deaths among at least a few of these groups, and yet the example I'd like to bring attention to comes from the Stormlight archive. In the opening scene of the entire series, we learn about the so-called Heralds, 10 immortal men and women fighting to protect the world from the villainous Voidbringers. But more importantly, we learn that death is of little consequence to them. Sure, death forces them away to another world to suffer for what might be centuries, but the moment anyone among them can endure the torment no longer, they all return to life once more. As such, the Heralds have long since mastered and overcome death, because to them it's temporary. Among these Heralds, there is Jezrien. He's one of the first Heralds we're introduced to, described as a young-looking man with a regal bearing to him, a man that always knows what to do. He's king of the Heralds and one of the most powerful practitioners of the magic that the world has to offer. To some, he is a god, to others, he is a saint and living martyr, a figure known in myth and lore as the greatest human who had ever lived. Needless to say, he is an eternal figure of both great power and importance. When Jezrien is stabbed in Oathbringer, the third entry of the series, he quickly realizes that something is wrong, and as the light fades from his eyes, the reader is confronted with a simple yet horrifying sentence: the final death of Jezrien. On the pages that follow, we learn of the ripples his death has sent across the world, as the other surviving heralds collapse, feeling something far, far worse than pain. Heralds who have known more suffering than any living soul, reduced to whimpering at the loss of their peer, knowing that this wasn't like their other deaths. This was something horrible. There is a kind of existential dread lurking within these lines. Since times immemorial, Jezrien and his fellow heralds have died time and time again. Even as he is stabbed, his first reaction is not one of fear or agony, but rather ridicule. By dying so many times, Jezrien's immortality is essentially as proven as can be, and it has lulled everyone, including the readers, into a false sense of security by believing in such a thing as true immortality. It grants comfort, leaving us as snug as a bug in a rug with the belief that all will be well forever, until that rug is pulled from us like one of Logan Paul's alleged crypto scams. It is the assumption that immortality will last forever that makes such a death thrice as shocking and painful to us. To see a man defy death and laugh in its face only to crumble in such a way, especially when his final death ends up being so meaningless and almost anticlimactic, well, it truly makes you fear the implications that this event carries with it. But then, how could the final death of such a vast immortal figure ever be anything but anticlimactic? Perhaps a more well-known example to those of you who aren't fans of Sanderson's books could be found in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. At the start of Avengers Infinity War, Loki makes an attempt to assassinate Thanos, an attempt which is not only thwarted with ease, but also results in Loki himself having his neck snapped like a twig and his body thrown away like a Garry's Mod ragdoll. Similar to my previous example, Loki is someone who has been known to have these fake-out deaths in the past, which also helps him feel more immortal than he really is. Again, the audience becomes accustomed to the idea that death doesn't really mean, well, death, whenever Loki's evolved anyway. On top of that, I suppose we shouldn't forget that he's based on an actual real-world mythological god that has been around for over 1,000 years, meaning that the character does in some ways have an ancient legacy even in the real world. So by having Thanos kill him with such ease at the start of the movie, it really sets the stakes and tone of what awaits. You begin to question what such horrible power might be capable of. And what's worse is we know that this is Thanos before he has reached his maximum power, so it's only downhill from here. If a god of trickery can be so easily foiled, who else might be in danger? After all, if even those who are eternal can be felled with such ease, what chance does a simple mortal stand? Now, Loki's death is sad and all, there's no denying that. His character growth over the course of nearly a decade's worth of movies probably has positioned him quite favorably in the eyes of the audience by the time he meets his end. But even so, I'd wager that this isn't even the most tragic death of an immortal that a Marvel movie has delivered, because there is, of course, Wolverine's death in Logan. Having a 200 200-year-old man who survived a literal nuclear blast be killed by a branch in a forest might not make you feel any dread, but it sure hammers home the sorrow of the situation. Look, it is a sad thing when an immortal dies. Not that it's not sad when an immortal character dies, but you get what I mean. Yeah, there are certainly some immortal entities, be they evil gods or tyrants that have outlived their welcome, who very much deserve to meet their end before the very end of time itself, and we seldom shed any tears for them. But for any immortal that isn't literally Elf Hitler, their deaths tend to leave behind a strange feeling of emptiness, at least in my experience. We consider it a tragedy when a dog dies at 3 years of age, but we might take solace in the long life it's gotten to live if it dies at the age of 16. But again, it becomes a tragedy if a human dies at age 16, because what is a mere 16 years of life if you could live 80? And in much the same way, what is 10,000 years to an immortal compared to infinity? In the end, it's all contextual. For mortals and immortals alike, there is a quote from Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray that rings equally true. The tragedy of old age is not that one is old, but that one is young. No matter if you live to 16 or 80, life will always pass by in the blink of an eye seen from an astronomical perspective. And this is equally true for dead immortals. To be immortal is to always be young, because given a truly infinite amount of time to live, then you will forever be at the very infancy of your eternal existence, as the finite time behind you will always pale when compared to the infinity that still awaits. And so when an immortal is killed, it always dies young. Too young. But there's even more to the sadness of a dead immortal than that. As a child, my first gaming console was the PlayStation 2. Since I mainly played games like LEGO Star Wars, the originals that is, and Star Wars Battlefront 2, also the original, there was a game that eluded me until I was well into my teenage years, and by sheer happenstance, it crossed my path in the form of a YouTube playthrough. That game was Shadow of the Colossus. While I am a Zoomer, I am of the aging variety that is more in common with a young millennial than a Gen Alpha kid, so when I say that I encountered the game in my teenage years, I must admit that it's been quite a while since then. As such, my memories about the game were fuzzy before I started working on the video, and I could barely remember anything from the story. You play as some guy who's trying to bring some girl back to life, and somewhere along the road you kill a bunch of colossi, and that's about it. But you know what really stood out to me about the game and hitched itself to my memory all these years? It was how the deaths of the titular colossi made me feel. The 16 eponymous colossi are these strange entities, with some of them being gargantuan golems carved from stone, truly deserving of their name, and others being smaller and seemingly bioorganic instead. As the player, you don't really know much about these colossi at all, especially not at the beginning of the game, but judging by the fact that some of them are quite literally overgrown with moss and foliage, it's quite easy to come to the conclusion that they must be both ancient and immortal. Although the colossi serve as the game's primary antagonists, at least as far as gameplay is concerned, I cannot help but mourn for their deaths. For each one that you fell, there is a strange, profound sorrow, as if something important has been lost, even though it is hard to tell if they were even sentient. This sorrowful feeling I'm trying to describe is different from empathy. When Gandalf is yoinked into the abyssal depths of Moria by the Balrog, I think most first-time readers or viewers of The Lord of the Rings will be distraught. Not because an immortal has been lost, but because of the empathy they felt at the death of such a beloved character. The same goes for the aforementioned examples of Loki or Wolverine, among others. But in my experience, the feeling I'm trying to describe is independent of any potential attachment to the immortal characters in question, which is why I like to separate it from empathy. No, what I mourn is something almost metaphysical. It is what these eternal beings represent and the loss of that. Let me try to illustrate. Losing a family pet hurts, and there is no need explaining why. If you hear a news story that Buster the German Shepherd from Springfield, Ohio died peacefully in his sleep at the ripe age of 15, you might still feel some semblance of sadness, in which case that would also be attributed to empathy, because you can imagine the pain of losing a beloved family pet. Depending on where you get those news, on the other hand, you might also find some crazy people trying to start a conspiracy about the dog getting eaten, but I digress. Imagine instead a future where you read an article that the last dog on Earth has died, rendering the entire species extinct. When we lament the loss of the last specimen of a species, we do so because of the time and legacy that it represented. Just take the northern white rhinos, for example. It's been ages since they quote-unquote served a utilitarian purpose in any sort of fauna or ecosystem, since there's just a few individuals left, but the inevitable day that the last of them dies will still be sad about it. I think the reason why this feeling gets shared with dead immortals stems from the fact that anyone who lives long enough amasses such a vast and unique portfolio of experiences that they stop merely being one specimen of their species and instead become something entirely singular. Think of all the historical events they may have witnessed and the unique perspective that could be provided by someone who recalls both the Battle of Hastings and the D-Day Normandy landings. And as a linguist, I'd be ecstatic at the opportunity to speak with and study a modern English speaker whose native language was Proto-Germanic. Each one of these immortals are almost like an ancient species all of their own, but with that, their species will go extinct upon their deaths. There is a point when an immortal stops being just an individual and ascends to become something greater. As I've said before, these people and creatures become permanent fixtures of the world, and as such, it is almost inevitable that they end up tied to important history or even culture itself. So when an immortal of such magnitude dies, it is a physical embodiment of the end of an era. I'd like to read something written by the famed romantic poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, which I find to neatly demonstrate what I'm talking about, namely his poem Ozymandias. I met a traveler from an antique land who said 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frowned and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed, and on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. I can't help but compare ancient and immortal beings to historical monuments. They are these things that people have regarded with awe over the course of millennia, and their very existence creates a common thread that is woven throughout generations. Ozymandias thought that his statue in his realm would exist forever, and yet by the time of Shelley's poem, the statue was in ruins and the once great realm had been swallowed completely by time and the deserts. Again, there is that faulty belief, much like there is with immortal beings, that just because rocks and metal don't have a clear expiration date, the grand monuments we build with them will be around forever, and because of that, mortal men of flesh seek their own immortality in stone. Likewise, great artists create great works meant to outlive their own fragile bodies so that their legacy may go on even after they themselves are gone. This summer I visited Prague and its surrounding area, which is a place that can best be described as a cornucopia of historical sites. But what's so fascinating about it is the connection you feel to the people of the past. It can feel almost unfathomable at times that we can stand there and look at something like the astronomical clock and see the same thing a late medieval bohemian peasant would have seen. Even if the clock itself doesn't remember the people that came to see it all those ages hence, it is somehow infused with the essence of the countless generations that preceded us through a tangible common experience. While we do not know exactly who they were, we can remember them as the millions or perhaps billions that have shaped and been shaped by these immortal monuments. But should these monuments ever disappear, then so shall all the people whose only memories intertwined in their history. While the statue of Ozymandias with its decapitated head and purposeless legs may still serve as a reminder of the king himself, the quote-unquote despair that his statue and realm were meant to evoke is long gone, and with it the connective thread to all the people who once felt it. At the risk of repeating myself, it is a sorrowful thing when such great monuments then fall. The loss is not just that of something pretty to look at, but the end of a collective and unifying experience. You can think of each such ancient building as an archive where fragments of every visitor and every event taking place in its vicinity are collected. A library of Alexandria, one might say. Perhaps you understand now why I claim that it's not empathy that motivates the feeling of sadness regarding the loss of immortals, any more than it's empathy that causes you to mourn the loss of great historical monuments. It wasn't empathy that made me feel sad when I heard about the Great Fire that had ravaged and threatened to completely destroy Notre Dame in 2019. After all, empathy is defined as the ability to understand and relate to the feelings of another, and it would be foolish to feel empathy for some stones that have lost their artistic shape because they never had any feelings in the first place, and I certainly wasn't feeling empathetic for the French because they're, well, French. In the same vein, this is the sadness I feel when the Colossi of Shadow of the Colossus fall. It's the same sadness I felt when Jezreel was permanently killed or when the Outsider died, regardless if it's only the soul of the persona or the body that once bore it. When an immortal dies, it doesn't die alone, because all the people whose last connection to the living hinged on its existence are wiped from the collective memory of the world alongside them. So as we near the end of this examination of the undying, I think we need to confront a rather difficult question, namely that of whether immortality is even desirable to begin with. As I've already stated, immortality is certainly something that has been desired by people for ages, and even those that don't seek it often end up envisioning a vivid afterlife as a substitute, which in many ways can be considered indistinguishable from eternal life anyway. But who can blame someone who seeks more time in life? After all, life passes by quickly. One moment you're watching Spongebob on a Tuesday morning before heading off to elementary school, and the next you're sat at the computer wondering what on earth a skibbity toilet is when you suddenly realize that you've got a tax form to fill in, followed by a feeling of existential dread that you have no idea when you became so old. Or maybe you post 2 YouTube videos and then all of a sudden half a year has gone by while you're still struggling to finish the script of your 3rd video. Could not be me. Not every immortal being enjoys their existence, though. Let's return to Deathloop for a moment. I find that the very concept of acquiring eternal life through a time loop creates a special sense of awfulness. I mean, place yourself in the shoes of Colt, Deathloop's protagonist. Every day you wake up to an island full of people that have no idea that they're living the same day again while you are entirely aware of everything. It would be utterly maddening. You can't build relationships with other people because they'll forget everything by sunrise. You can't make lasting art because any traces of it would be erased at the end of the day. You can't even game over yourself in Minecraft because you'll just be reborn with the advent of a new day. There's even an example of this with Pexels, one of the only 3 characters in the game that do retain their memories between every loop, and she's determined to put a bullet in her own skull every morning, except first she needs to rewrite the same note every day, begging for anyone who might also experience her same condition to please come find her before she ends herself for the millionth time the next day. Yeah. The loop might very well contain the only surviving enclave of humans in the now void-swallowed world, but is their existence even worth saving if it's going to be that miserable? Yes, they are alive, but aside from Colt, Juliana, and Pexels, nobody's truly alive. They're broken machines repeating the same action over and over and over with no recollection of anything. It's an utterly hollow existence and in many ways completely antithetical to the dynamic ways that define life as it should be. But naturally, Deathloop isn't the first time immortality has been painted in a negative and outright undesirable light. Take Carol Chapek's play, The Macropolis Secret, for instance, where we follow a woman given 300 years of renewable immortality but chooses not to prolong her life at the first available opportunity. Or how about Alexander Bogdanov's short story Immortality Day, where the very inventor of immortality itself is determined to end his own suffering after realizing what a great tragedy human life is, to receive power from God just to transform into an automaton that repeats itself with the precision of a mechanical clock, an eternally living body joined to an eternally dead spirit, cold and indifferent like an extinguished sun. So what exactly is immortality anyway? Is an eternal afterlife to be considered immortality? Probably not, because if you seek eternal life, you don't want to gamble on the existence of an undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. An eternally beating heart then? Well, no, you don't get much use out of a heart if the brain don't work. What if your soul is eternally reincarnated? Does that constitute immortality? Alexander Bogdanov makes a compelling argument against it, writing that it would only mean that the present, currently existing I, with all my thoughts, feelings, and desires, would disappear without a trace. Someone else, unknown and alien to me, would go on thinking and feeling in my stead. How about a clone then? Can a perfect clone with your exact personality and all your memories be considered an extension of your life? I mean, although clones might maintain the illusion of a single immortal being on the outside, realistically it's just a series of identical twins with shared memories that replace each other when the time is right, while each clone's individual consciousness will end at their respective deaths. So is immortality an infinite continuum of consciousness then? If so, what happens when you begin to change? You might still live, but your character, the thing that ultimately defines you above all else, might be dead and buried after only a short time of your immortal life. The philosopher Bernard Williams writes about this precise conundrum in his treatise about why immortality sucks. In discussing how an immortal with a static character will eventually exhaust all new experiences that are appropriate for them to have and thereby suffer eternal boredom, he also acknowledges the possibility of breaking free of this perspective loop of monotony and comments that then the problem shifts to the relation between these varied experiences and the fixed character. How can it remain fixed through an endless series of very various experiences? As such, the only choice for a sufficiently old immortal seems to be staying the same and suffering the boredom, or changing and in doing so killing the thing that makes you you. Though change might not always be voluntary, and we can look to the Stormlight Archive's heralds for an example. Some 4,500 years after their golden age of heroism, all 10 of the heralds have fallen far from grace as they have abandoned their oaths and let the traumatic millennia in their past wear them down to madness. And Jezrien, aka the greatest human that had ever lived, is no exception to this, though he might have honestly gotten off the hook easily when he turned into a drunken lunatic, because some of his peers have outright turned into villains. While Jezrien's death on Oathbringer was his final death, you might very well make the argument that his true death occurred a long time before, because there is no trace left of the man that his name once represented. He is a king without subjects, a mage without magic, and a god whose worshippers don't recognize him. After all, who would believe that the drunken beggar at the next table is the man they worship? In the end, with his spirit completely and utterly broken, only his body remains immortal, until even that is taken from him. Even if you don't quite go mad with the passing of eternity, change still plays a role. I previously mentioned how being immortal and living long enough can shape you into something entirely unique, but there is another view of this which is presented well by Jorge Luis Borges in his short story The Immortal, where the protagonist argues quite the opposite. They knew that over an infinitely long span of time, all things happened to all men. As a reward for his past and future virtues, every man merited every kindness, yet also every betrayal as a reward for his past and future iniquities. Much as the way in games of chance heads and tails tend to even out, so cleverness and dullness cancel and correct each other. No one is someone. A single immortal man is all men. Like Cornelius Agrippa, I am God, hero, philosopher, demon, and world. I want to argue with Borges, but he raises a good point. What he's invoking is essentially the same logic that props up the so-called infinite Monke theorem, which posits that a monkey with a typewriter will eventually write the complete works of Shakespeare if he's given enough time. And please, do view this monkey as a humorous stand-in for a true randomizer. Some people get confused thinking that the monkey needs to recreate those texts with intent, which admittedly makes it more unlikely that it would happen unless they also had the time to evolve into new humans. Borges has even written about his own version of the infinite Monke theorem in his short story The Library of Babel, which tells of a library in which every possible permutation of written characters can be found, meaning that everything that could ever be written can be found somewhere among all the nearly infinite gibberish. In any case, just think about all the great change that can occur in a single individual even over the course of a natural human lifespan. There's a quote about this in Oathbringer, about everyone's favorite rehabilitated war criminal, Dalinar Kholin. He hadn't lived as 2 or 4 or 6 men. He had lived as thousands. For each day he became someone slightly different. Decent people might abandon all their morals at the prospect of wealth and proverbially sell their souls for fame, or on the contrary, murderers might become upstanding citizens, trying their hardest to prevent others from going down the same straight path that they themselves once did. So now extrapolate all these little changes over the course of an immortal's lifespan, and you'll probably come to realize that the person you may have once loved is long gone, replaced by an undying skinwalker that has little in common with whoever they once were. Ultimately, it is no secret that all people eventually need to come to terms with the knowledge that they will all die someday. Bernard Williams even argues that immortality would be meaningless, so in a sense, death gives the meaning to life. But maybe death doesn't have to be the end of us. It's been said by many people in many different ways that we live on through those who live after us, in their memories, in their hearts, or in their very DNA. Sometimes the ways that the dead live on is even externally visible, as the living who were once close to them adopt their view of life, or just little mannerisms and phrases of theirs. In our real world, where immortality is only a thing of myth and fiction, we can only pursue this kind of immortalization, or preservation of our memory beyond our deaths. For most of us, our sphere of influence is limited to our friends and family, but for those of us who leave behind a legacy of greatness, be it great good or great evil, they are able to root their metaphorical immortality in the spirits of many more, as their actions will leave a mark on a great number of people. And yet there is a great flaw in this idea of immortalization, because not even that lasts forever. I might carry some of the memories of my grandmother's parents with me, but I don't know the first thing about their parents, and I know even less about my ancestors that came before them. And similarly, how many years will people remember me after I'm gone? Even those legendary people who we might say have been immortalized by being known to millions or billions of people, and whose memory is passed down from generation to generation over the course of centuries or millennia, even they will be forgotten like the rest of us eventually. And not even our fictional immortal characters are completely without an end, because someday the books they live within will no longer be in print, and all their existing copies will have been moth-eaten beyond legibility. Sure, something like the works of Shakespeare might persist exist for centuries or millennia more, but will they survive a nuclear apocalypse or an ecological collapse and outlive humanity itself? If so, can art truly even live without anyone to perceive it? Do Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet and Macbeth, and King Lear and Falstaff all die with the last person to have read about them? Or can they be considered alive because some dusty old manuscript remains in an abandoned cellar long after humanity has been wiped out from Earth? Do they exist in some Schrödinger's character state, being simultaneously alive and dead until an alien can open the proverbial box that is the cellar and determine whether there is anything remaining of the text that can be deciphered and read once more? The logical, albeit ironic conclusion would be that the only way for you to truly immortalize anything in memory is to be immortal yourself. While working on this video, I've been rereading the Stormlight archive. Shocker, am I right? And the vow of the Edge Dancers to remember those who have been forgotten really struck a chord with me. Suddenly made even more sense why I've ended up being assigned to the Order of the Edge Dancers every time I've taken the Knight Radiant quiz, though I've never really questioned why, since I've always been a healer/support main in just about every video game I've ever played. In any case, part of me wishes that I could be immortal, not only for its potential implicit benefits, but so that I can ensure that my family and friends are immortalized through my eternal memory of them. But unfortunately, the irony of immortalization seems to run even deeper than that. Even if you are immortal, trying your hardest to keep your loved ones eternally alive in your heart, what happens when your memories of them begin to fade piece by piece? Fallout 4's DLC Far Harbor features an example of this during an encounter centered around one of the game's main player companions, Nick Valentine. When he meets Dima, a fellow android of a similar make to himself, Nick is surprised to hear Dima proclaim that they are brothers, prompting the following exchange.
You were my brother, Nick.
If I were your brother, I'd remember.
That's where you'd be wrong. This happened over a century ago. There's only so much memory that can fit into the prototype brains we have.
I've heard enough.
Unless you've got some magical or otherwise external way of storing your memories, then given enough time, it is only a biological reality that your brain will inevitably begin to erase your oldest memories to make room for whatever happened in your 34th century of life, leaving little room to spare for nostalgia. First, their scent might go, then the little ways that they moved, the sound of their voice, their face, and eventually even your shared experiences and most treasured memories together. But let's change the angle of this for a moment and concern ourselves only with our own immortalization following death, and not how we can best immortalize others. The Roman Epicurean philosopher Lucretius once wrote in his philosophical poem titled On the Nature of Things that, "For if woe and ail perchance are toward, then the man to whom the bane can happen must himself be there at the same time. But death precludeth this, forbidding life to him on whom might crowd such irk and care." Or to put it more simply, in order for bad things to happen to you, you must first exist, and because you are dead, you do not exist and can therefore not suffer the bad things. And this is all true. I may wish to be remembered beyond my death now, but what if I'm not? Nobody can say for certain if I'll be quote-unquote immortalized until I'm already dead, and by then it won't matter anymore since I can't be sad when all memory of me fades into the ether. As long as I live, I can't suffer from being forgotten since it hasn't happened yet, and when I'm dead, I can't suffer at all, so why pretend that these desires to be immortalized mean anything at all? It's rather stupid to desire things for a point in time when you can no longer feel or experience them in the first place, isn't it? And so, in the end, it appears that even the struggle to keep the dead eternally alive through memory is as fruitless and impossible of a pursuit as true immortality itself. No matter what ideas we might come up with to circumvent or cope with the idea of death as the final end of us all, there seems to be no true escape from it. We're all doomed to die, first when our physical form gives out, and then again when we are thought of for the last time. Well, there's also a third death called La Petite Mort, or the Little Death, which most of you will probably experience at least once or twice before you finally take a stroll across the real Rainbow Bridge, but that's a topic I'll gladly leave for someone else's video. I think to some extent, the loss of immortality in fiction is representative of something true to the core of the human experience. The death of an immortal is a subversion of a subversion. We all know that nothing is permanent, as much as we may want it to be, and yet, when an immortal entity is presented to us, we're more than happy to throw out all our preconceived assumptions about the cycle of life and death. But when these immortals then ultimately die, it is a reminder that all the grief and strife over the inevitable serves little purpose beyond making your finite time in life more stressful and less enjoyable. The certainty that all all life must come to an end might be the only one without exceptions, since at least taxes can be circumvented if you move to the Cayman Islands or just never make any money in the first place. Alas, lamentable as it might be, the heat death of the universe shall eventually bring an end to it all, even that which seems immortal. But who knows? Maybe in the aftermath of the end of all things, a single eternal Monke with a typewriter will be reborn to write out not only the entirety of Shakespeare's works, but the history of us all, to be slotted into the library of Babel, where we will truly be immortalized on its shelves.
By the way, if you made it this far, I still want to live forever, so make sure you subscribe or I'll just feed your soul to my phylactery. Okay, bye.